History is often remembered through carefully chosen fragments, polished speeches, and official records that reduce unspeakable atrocities to neat lines in textbooks. But hidden deep inside archives, sealed in dusty folders marked top secret and eyes only, are the stories too disturbing for public consumption. Under the file header, 5 disturbed WWII agendas that were censored into oblivion, 5 shadows emerge, each buried under decades of deliberate silence. These shadows are not myths, nor are they the inventions of conspiracy. They are footnotes erased from history books, testimonies blacked out in ink, and documents shredded to preserve the illusion of noble war. What lingers in their fragments is a chilling reminder that wars are never clean, alliances are rarely honest, and justice is often sacrificed at the altar of politics. Imagine corridors in Washington, Moscow, and London, where the air smells of stale smoke and secrecy, where agents whisper about Vatican pacts, erased war crimes, forbidden experiments, and scientists whose reputations were rebuilt on human suffering. These files were not lost by accident. They were silenced with intent, locked away to protect the reputations of nations and institutions. What follows are not just stories, but censored truths, truths carved from the shadows of World War II, resurfacing after generations of denial. Chapter 1. Classified Pact of the Vatican's Silence. In the winter of 1942, as Europe smouldered under the iron grip of Nazi Germany, the Vatican stood at the crossroads of faith and politics. Behind the high stone walls of the Apostolic Palace, where the air smelled faintly of parchment and incense, a secret dialogue unfolded that would never be recorded in official church histories. According to declassified fragments from OSS intelligence files and intercepted British SIS cables, the Vatican entered into what operatives referred to as Operation Concordat. This was not a formal treaty etched in ink, but rather a tacit understanding, neutrality in exchange for silence. The Vatican would remain quiet about the systematic extermination taking place in Eastern Europe, while Germany ensured the survival of Catholic influence across occupied territories. What emerged was not the hand of divine neutrality, but a carefully calculated pact of survival and influence. Reports smuggled from Polish clergy in 1942, compiled in what would later be known as the Lwów dossier, described priests witnessing the deportation of Jews from Galicia, entire synagogues set ablaze, and mass shootings by Einsatzgruppen units. These testimonies, marked with trembling signatures, were couriered through underground channels to Rome. Yet the Vatican's response, noted in marginalia within OSS intelligence briefs, was muted to the point of silence. Vatican officials feared that public denunciation might provoke Hitler to unleash retaliation against Catholics in Poland, France, and Italy. Pope Pius V's silence has long been debated, but the file suggests more than reluctance. It suggests deliberate suppression, coordinated through Swiss banking intermediaries, where Vatican assets were shielded from seizure by the Reich. In one particularly damning cable, labelled Ultra Secret, Vatican Intercepts, November 1942, British intelligence recorded a meeting between German ambassador Ernst von Weizsäcker and Vatican Secretary of State Luigi Maglione. The ambassador pressed for continued neutrality and warned that ill-considered statements could endanger millions. The response was chillingly pragmatic. The Vatican promised restraint, emphasizing its mission to safeguard Christian unity above all else. This assurance gave the Nazis confidence that Rome would not interfere with deportations from Slovakia, Croatia, and Hungary. Meanwhile, Vatican radio broadcasts remained ambiguous, never explicitly naming the Jews or condemning the extermination machinery operating in Poland. Financial records deepened the shadows. Investigators tracing Vatican accounts through the Swiss Bank Corporation in Basel uncovered coded transactions tied to German industrial firms, including IG Farben and Krupp. Though sanitized for public release, uncensored reports showed that the Vatican channeled assets to protect church holdings, using neutral Swiss territory as the clearinghouse. These transfers, linked under the cryptonym Project Concordat, ensured Vatican solvency while millions perished in silence. The war was not only fought on battlefields, but also in ledgers, with balance sheets serving as weapons of influence and survival. By 1944, as Allied forces advanced into Italy, whispers about Vatican complicity grew louder in intelligence circles. OSS officer Alan Dulles, stationed in Bern, drafted memoranda cautioning against exposing Vatican neutrality agreements, fearing such revelations would fracture Catholic support in France and Spain. Churchill himself reportedly ordered files pertaining to Concordat sealed, noting that to unmask Rome would jeopardize our fragile alliance. In Washington, Roosevelt's administration concurred, prioritizing Catholic votes in upcoming elections and diplomatic leverage in post-war Europe over transparency. The Vatican, shielded by its position as both spiritual power and sovereign state, emerged from the war untarnished in the eyes of the public. But fragments of truth surfaced in unexpected places. A Soviet intelligence file dated 1946, unearthed decades later, accused the Vatican of moral collusion with fascist regimes, citing the same 1942 agreements. For Moscow, this became ammunition in its propaganda war, though the West dismissed such claims as communist distortions. Yet when cross-referenced with British and American cables, the uncomfortable consistency could not be ignored. Vatican silence was not accidental. It was systemic, coordinated, and preserved by the highest levels of Allied leadership. The deliberate erasure began almost immediately after the war. Vatican archives, classified under Archivum Secretum Apostolicum, remained inaccessible to historians for generations. Files within British intelligence labelled Ultra-Secret Vatican were marked for destruction in 1951, allegedly to prevent leaks during the escalating Cold War. The Americans followed suit, transferring their most sensitive Vatican files into the CIA's restricted vaults, stamped eyes only. Scholars were left with fragments, letters missing critical paragraphs, cables cut mid-sentence, financial records abruptly ending without explanation. The silence of the archives mirrored the silence of the war itself. What makes this agenda so disturbing is not only the moral compromise, but the institutional survival it enabled. The Vatican emerged from World War II intact, its influence in Italy, Spain, and South America preserved, its assets safeguarded through neutral banking havens. Meanwhile, the voices of Polish priests, Jewish victims, and underground couriers were extinguished, their testimonies relegated to the shadows of censored intelligence reports. Operation Concordat was never officially acknowledged, but its imprint lingers in the erased lines of history, the missing files, and the unanswered questions about the cost of silence. In the corridors of power, the Vatican's neutrality was hailed as wisdom, but in the corridors of history, it remains a silence that screams louder than any condemnation. The pact between faith and fascism, though never publicly admitted, was real enough to alter the fate of millions, and to stain the legacy of an institution that presented itself as humanity's conscience. Classified, forbidden, and nearly obliterated, the evidence of this silence is perhaps the most haunting example of how truth is often sacrificed to protect institutions rather than people. Chapter 2. Forbidden Soviet Nazi Technology Transfers Exposed. Long before the Red Army thundered into Berlin and raised its banner over the Reichstag, a different kind of battle unfolded in secret workshops and hidden laboratories. It was not fought with tanks or rifles, but with drafts of blueprints, rolls of microfilm, and the careful exchange of forbidden knowledge. Though Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin appeared as sworn enemies after June 22, 1941, the day Operation Barbarossa began, the truth concealed in Soviet and German archives tells a far darker story. What emerges from fragments of declassified CIA translations and Soviet defectors' testimonies is the spectre of collaboration, carried out even after the official rupture of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. It was a clandestine traffic of science, recorded under cryptonyms like Project Metallic and Operation Wintergrain. This secret trade gave both sides access to knowledge that would shape the trajectory of warfare for decades to come. The roots stretched back to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, beyond. Its infamous secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. There were technical annexes, poorly documented in official records, that outlined exchanges of industrial materials and weapons research. German engineers were observed in Soviet metallurgical plants, while Soviet oil and grain flowed into the Reich by the trainload. When Barbarossa shattered the alliance in 1941, one might assume all such collaboration ceased instantly. Yet intelligence files suggest otherwise. The machinery of covert scientific exchange continued, operating through neutral intermediaries and shadow networks established before the invasion. A decrypted cable from 1942, preserved in fragments within British SIS archives, described a convoy routed through occupied Poland. Officially, it carried agricultural equipment destined for Leningrad under Red Cross cover. In reality, the cargo contained components resembling turbojet compressors, parts eerily similar to those later identified in German Messerschmitt jet prototypes. Soviet operatives disguised as railway inspectors supervised the transport. The report, marked "Most Secret, Do Not Circulate," implied that high-level authorizations had sanctioned this transfer, despite the open war between Berlin and Moscow. The name Wintergrain appears in several surviving CIA translations of captured Soviet files. According to defectors interviewed in the early 1960s, Wintergrain referred to the covert appropriation of V-2 rocket technology smuggled from occupied territories. Soviet engineers allegedly received fragments of guidance systems, fueling diagrams, and even captured technicians moved under false prisoner identities. One particularly damning testimony, given by a Polish resistance courier in 1944, described crates offloaded in Brest-Litovsk labeled as farming equipment, though their contents bore the markings of Peenemünde laboratories. These shipments, if genuine, provided Stalin's scientists with a crucial head start in missile research, one that Cold War analysts later struggled to explain. The collaboration was not limited to rocketry. Chemical warfare research appears repeatedly in censored Soviet documents. In a file coded Metallic 7, Soviet operatives catalogued nerve agents known as tabun and sarin, substances originally developed by IG Farben. Witnesses later claimed that German scientists, fearing loss of favor in Berlin, discreetly sold or traded formula notes to NKVD intermediaries. By 1943, fragments of these agents were allegedly tested in Soviet facilities near Saratov. Though official Soviet denials were absolute, Western intelligence, confronted with reports of these exchanges, deemed them politically non-usable, fearing disclosure would undermine the fragile alliance keeping Hitler contained. The post-war implications reveal why these files were obliterated. By 1945, the Soviets had accelerated their jet aircraft development at an astonishing rate, fielding designs that mirrored German prototypes with uncanny precision. Their missile program, spearheaded by Sergei Korolev, leapt forward with knowledge that defied the timeline of mere battlefield captures. For American analysts reviewing the evidence in 1946, one conclusion seemed unavoidable. Moscow had acquired sensitive German designs long before the war ended. This possibility was too dangerous to admit, for it would suggest Allied intelligence had underestimated Soviet duplicity and had fought alongside a partner already preparing for the next war. In Washington, fragments of these findings reached the Joint Intelligence Committee. A report, now lost but referenced in later memos, recommended permanent suppression of any material linking the Soviets to wartime technology transfers with the Reich. To expose it would fracture public perception of the good war, and more importantly, weaken the justification for post-war tribunals where German scientists were condemned as singular villains. In reality, their knowledge had been bartered and shared, tainting the narrative of absolute enmity between Hitler and Stalin. Moscow, too, had reasons to bury the truth. After victory, Soviet propaganda painted the USSR as the sole defender against fascism, erasing any trace of earlier partnership. Any suggestion of continued exchange after Barbarossa would devastate the myth of heroic resistance. Soviet censors scoured archives, destroyed incriminating files, and silenced officers who had knowledge of Wintergrain or Metallic. Several NKVD operatives tied to the transfers vanished during the late 1940s purges, their names struck from personnel lists. Whether they were executed or merely reassigned to Gulag camps remains unclear, but their disappearance ensured that inconvenient truths stayed buried. The Cold War gave Western agencies further incentive to suppress the material. By the time the CIA acquired partial Soviet files in 1963 via a defector codenamed Gideon, the political climate demanded silence. Admitting that Stalin had collaborated with Hitler even during the bloodiest years of the Eastern Front would destabilize NATO unity and empower Soviet counter-propaganda, so the files were locked away, stamped with warnings, and buried in restricted vaults. Researchers who stumbled upon references found themselves stonewalled, their requests denied under the pretext of national security. Even today, what survives are only fragments, coded references, intercepted cables, scattered testimonies from resistance couriers and defectors. The complete record has been erased, not by accident, but by the deliberate hand of both East and West. Yet the technological leap of the Soviet Union in the immediate aftermath of World War II remains an unanswered question. How did Moscow's engineers achieve breakthroughs in jets, missiles, and chemical weapons at such unprecedented speed? The whispered answer lingers in the shadows of Project Metallic and Operation Wintergrain, because they were never starting from scratch. The narrative of absolute enmity between the Soviets and Nazis is one of the pillars of modern history, but hidden beneath that narrative lies a darker, forbidden truth. Knowledge does not respect battle lines. Science is currency, and in the chaos of war, even sworn enemies may trade in secrets if survival demands it. This was the reality of the forbidden transfers. Transactions so disturbing that both victors and vanquished agreed on one thing: the world must never know. Chapter 3: Erased Trials of Allied War Crimes. The world remembers Nuremberg as a triumph of justice, a solemn reckoning where Nazi leaders were judged for crimes against humanity. Photographs of the tribunal, black-robed judges, stern prosecutors, and rows of defeated German generals have become symbols of moral clarity. Yet beneath the surface of this courtroom theatre, documents reveal a parallel narrative, one carefully smothered by censors and fireproof safes. Among sealed transcripts and destroyed evidence lies proof that the victors of World War II, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, were not merely liberators. They were also perpetrators. Their crimes, though different in scope, were real, documented, and then deliberately erased to preserve the illusion of purity. What remains today are traces of erased testimonies, burned files, and whispered accounts of atrocities committed under Allied flags, covered up in the name of victory. The most glaring omissions surround the firebombing campaigns against German and Japanese cities. In February 1945, Dresden burned in a firestorm so intense that pavement melted and oxygen vanished from entire neighborhoods, suffocating those who had fled underground. British Bomber Command, under Sir Arthur Harris, had targeted a city swollen with refugees, producing carnage far beyond any military necessity. Yet when German defense attorneys at Nuremberg attempted to raise the issue, the judges cut off their arguments. The firebombing of Dresden, Hamburg, and Tokyo was redefined as strategic necessity. Internal British memoranda, stamped most confidential, reveal the truth. Prosecutors feared that opening the subject would expose the Allies to charges equal to those levelled against Göring and Jodl. The files note with chilling brevity, not usable, suppress. American files tell a similar story. Declassified OSS memoranda from 1946, later destroyed in an unexplained 1952 fire at a Kent Army depot, describe reports of mass executions carried out by US units in Italy and France. Prisoners of war, sometimes in groups of hundreds, were shot after surrender, their deaths buried in operational losses. Survivors' testimonies never reached the tribunal floor. In one suppressed annex, known by its cryptonym Operation Eagle's Nest, Polish resistance fighters testified to massacres committed by advancing Soviet forces. Entire villages, especially in eastern Poland and East Prussia, were annihilated under the guise of liberation. Civilians were raped, deported, or summarily executed. Yet to present such evidence in 1946 would have shattered the fragile Allied unity needed to conclude the war against Japan, and so the documents were sealed, classified, and later destroyed. The Soviet record is darker still. Archival notes suggest that Western prosecutors deliberately omitted evidence of the Katyn massacre, where thousands of Polish officers were executed by the NKVD in 1940. Moscow insisted the crime was German. To maintain the alliance, Britain and the United States agreed to silence. American officers privately admitted they possessed evidence pointing directly at the Soviets, including forensic reports smuggled out of occupied Poland, but these were never presented at Nuremberg. Instead, the court permitted the Soviet prosecution to argue German responsibility, a lie preserved for decades until the late 20th century. The truth had been buried beneath political necessity. What is most disturbing is the existence of a sealed annex to the Nuremberg proceedings, rumored to contain hundreds of pages of testimony regarding Allied crimes. Witnesses, including displaced persons from Eastern Europe, described atrocities committed not by Nazis, but by liberating armies. In one account, a French civilian testified to the deliberate starvation of German POWs in the infamous Rhine Meadows camps, where thousands perished in the months after surrender. In another, Italian villagers named British commanders who had ordered the execution of captured German paratroopers. These testimonies were recorded, transcribed, and then promptly classified. By the early 1950s, when attention had shifted to the Cold War, the annex was reportedly destroyed, its absence explained away as routine disposal of sensitive material. The obliteration of these records was not incidental, it was policy. Churchill, Roosevelt, and later Truman all understood that exposing Allied crimes would poison the fragile moral narrative of the war. Justice had to be one-sided for the sake of political legitimacy. Prosecutors at Tokyo and Nuremberg were instructed to focus solely on Axis crimes. The British Foreign Office circulated directives warning against moral equivalence, insisting that comparisons would dilute the impact of proceedings. Behind these euphemisms lay the naked truth. Victors do not stand trial. Even when isolated fragments surfaced decades later, they were met with denial or dismissal. Survivors of Allied atrocities were told their memories were false, their testimonies unreliable. Historians who pressed the issue found archives mysteriously inaccessible, their requests denied. The 1952 fire in Kent, which destroyed thousands of files related to prisoner treatment, was labelled accidental. Yet intelligence reports from the time indicate the fire began in a locked storage room containing documents specifically flagged for review. To this day, the coincidence has never been explained. The legacy of these erased trials lingers in silence. Public memory still clings to the idea of absolute justice at Nuremberg, untainted by hypocrisy. But in the shadows of history, one cannot escape the knowledge that trials meant to represent universal justice were compromised from the beginning. They were instruments of power, crafted to shape memory, to draw a clear line between evil and virtue. Yet the line was never clear. It was drawn in ink, redacted, and rewritten until it reflected not truth, but necessity. This, perhaps, is the most haunting aspect of the erased trials. They reveal that even when humanity sought to create a universal standard of justice, politics triumphed over truth. Atrocities committed by the Allies were not smaller, nor were they less real. They were simply inconvenient, unfit for the narrative of liberation, and so they were erased. The victims remain nameless, their suffering unacknowledged, their pleas consigned to ashes in a Kent depot fire. History remembers only one side of the ledger, because the other was deliberately torn out. And yet, the fragments remain. Cables, censored transcripts, suppressed testimonies whispered by survivors. They are enough to remind us that victory does not absolve, and that justice built on silence is no justice at all. The trials were staged as a reckoning for humanity, but humanity was filtered through power, and power chose to remember only half the truth. Chapter 4: Hidden Agendas Behind Operation Paperclip. The story of Operation Paperclip is often told as a tale of pragmatism, a reluctant but necessary choice by the United States to bring German scientists into American service after the war. Official histories speak of rockets and space exploration, of men like Wernher von Braun transforming from servants of Hitler into pioneers of NASA. Yet the sanitized version is a mask. Beneath it lies a far darker reality. A program built not on reluctant necessity, but on deliberate deceit. Recently declassified files reveal that Operation Paperclip was not simply recruitment, but a wholesale laundering of war criminals' pasts. Their ties to the SS, to forced labor, to human experimentation were carefully erased, replaced with new identities and rewritten service records. It was a hidden agenda, buried by secrecy stamps and false dossiers, one that turned perpetrators of atrocities into celebrated architects of American progress. The operation began in 1945 under the name Overcast. The first targets were members of the V2 program captured as the Reich collapsed. Von Braun, Dornberger and their teams surrendered in Bavaria, bringing with them crates of blueprints and fragments of unfinished rockets. Yet their surrender came with a condition: protection from prosecution. Allied intelligence officers quickly realized the value of these men. Germany had developed technology years ahead of American programs, and in the coming Cold War, Washington could not afford to let Moscow acquire it first. Thus began the cleansing. SS files were rewritten, documents tying scientists to slave labor at Mittelwerk, where thousands of prisoners from Dora concentration camp died under horrific conditions, were quietly buried. Von Braun's SS rank was omitted from public records. Survivors' testimonies describing starvation, beatings, and executions at the rocket tunnels were dismissed as unreliable. In the official version, these scientists were apolitical technicians, reluctantly serving Hitler, now redeemed as servants of democracy. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, oversaw the deception. Its directive was clear: no scientist of military value should be lost to the United States. That phrase, repeated across memos, justified systematic erasure. Scientists directly implicated in human experimentation, such as Dr. Hubertus Strughold, later hailed as the father of space medicine, were shielded from scrutiny. Reports of his participation in freezing experiments on prisoners at Dachau were suppressed. Strughold would go on to hold prestigious positions in American aerospace medicine, his past hidden by redacted files. Similarly, Walter Schreiber, implicated in biological warfare programs, was relocated under a false name, protected from Soviet extradition requests. These were not isolated cases. Hundreds of scientists were whitewashed, their crimes erased in the name of national interest. The deception extended beyond Germany. American officers deliberately obscured the extent of Soviet recruitment efforts, which paralleled Paperclip under codenames such as Operation Osoaviakim. In 1946, Soviet military police rounded up thousands of German specialists, transporting them to the USSR under armed guard. To maintain the illusion of moral superiority, Washington suppressed evidence that its own methods mirrored those of its rival. At times, American and Soviet operatives competed openly, seizing laboratories and kidnapping scientists from collapsing German towns. The hunt for technology was ruthless, its morality non-existent. What the public never learned was that Paperclip's scope went far beyond rockets. Files reveal recruitment in chemical warfare, biological research, and advanced aviation. Men tied to horrific experiments were relocated to US bases in Alabama, Texas, and Ohio. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, Nazi research on anthrax and plague was quietly integrated into American biological warfare programs, despite official denials. The justification was always the same: the Soviets would use it if we did not. Thus, knowledge born from torture and murder was legitimized under a new flag. Victims' suffering became data points, their deaths hidden in classified appendices. The cover-up was meticulous. Scientists' dossiers were rewritten, with incriminating sections removed or stamped, "Do not circulate." When Nuremberg prosecutors requested files on individuals later recruited under Paperclip, those requests were delayed or ignored until trials concluded. In one case, a prosecutor prepared charges against a rocket engineer linked to forced labor deaths at Dora. The case collapsed when the accused mysteriously disappeared from custody, later resurfacing in the United States as part of a research team at White Sands. The official record listed him as released due to insufficient evidence. In truth, the evidence had been buried by the very government now employing him. Even Congress was deceived. Hearings into Paperclip in the 1950s received sanitized briefings, while classified annexes describing human experimentation were withheld. When investigative journalists attempted to probe the operation in the 1960s, they were stonewalled with national security claims. Documents remained sealed for decades, trickling out only after Freedom of Information Act requests in the late 20th century. By then, many of the men were dead, their crimes unpunished, their reputations intact. Von Braun had become a national hero. Strughold honored with awards, others buried with military honors. The victims, nameless prisoners worked to death in tunnels or used as test subjects, remained erased from the official narrative. The hidden agenda behind Operation Paperclip was not just about acquiring knowledge. It was about rewriting history. By cleansing the pasts of these men, the United States also cleansed its own conscience, presenting its post-war achievements as untainted by collaboration with evil. Yet every rocket launched, every medical breakthrough attributed to these scientists, carried with it a silent legacy of suffering. The victims of Dora, Dachau, and countless unnamed camps paid with their lives for data that was later repackaged as progress. Their screams echoed in laboratories, but their names were left out of textbooks. This erasure was deliberate. It was a choice made at the highest levels of government, justified by the looming Cold War. To admit the truth would have undermined America's claim to moral leadership. Better to bury the files, redact the names, and present a sanitized story. And so Operation Paperclip became not just a recruitment program, but a monument to selective memory. Its success was measured not only in rockets and satellites, but in how completely it buried the truth of its origins. The hidden agendas behind Paperclip remind us that history is often written not by the victors alone, but by those who control the archives. In the battle between morality and survival, survival won. The cost was justice denied, memory erased, and a future built on the unacknowledged suffering of the past. Chapter 5. Disturbing Experiments of Unit 731. Erased. Among the most terrifying silences of World War II is the absence of full accountability for Japan's Unit 731. This sprawling biological warfare division, headquartered in Harbin, Manchuria, operated under the euphemistic cover of the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. In reality, it was a vast complex of death laboratories where men, women, and children were subjected to experiments of unimaginable cruelty. Vivisections performed without anesthesia, frostbite trials carried out in sub-zero conditions, plague bombs tested on entire villages. Unit 731's crimes rivaled, and in some ways exceeded, those committed in Nazi camps. Yet what is most disturbing is not only what the unit did, but what was erased after Japan's surrender. The most damning evidence of these crimes was not hidden by Tokyo alone, but deliberately suppressed by the United States in exchange for exclusive access to the data. Thus, a trove of human suffering was transformed into a classified scientific archive, locked away at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and erased from public consciousness. General Shiro Ishii, the unit's commanding officer, presided over a vast operation employing thousands of personnel. His empire included multiple sub-units, coded as 731 through 100, spread across occupied China. Prisoners, euphemistically called marutas or logs, were plucked from villages, prisons, and battlefields. Chinese civilians, Russian POWs, Korean forced laborers, and even Allied captives found themselves inside the walls of Pingfang, the largest facility. There, under floodlights and barbed wire, experiments were conducted with a precision that mirrored clinical research. Only the subjects were alive. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid. Limbs were amputated to study regeneration, organs removed for observation, wounds inflicted to measure blood loss. Winter frostbite trials saw prisoners' arms plunged into freezing water, then beaten with sticks until ice crystals crackled under the skin. The results were meticulously recorded, charted, and compiled into scientific reports. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, survivors expected justice. Evidence of Unit 731's atrocities was undeniable. Bombed villages, recovered medical instruments, testimonies from liberated prisoners. The Soviets quickly moved to prosecute. In December 1949, at the Khabarovsk trials, 12 Japanese officers were convicted for biological warfare. But these proceedings, conducted in Soviet courts, were dismissed in the West as propaganda. What the world did not know was that Washington had already cut a deal. Intelligence memoranda between General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo and the US War Department reveal an agreement: immunity for Ishii and his top associates. In exchange for their research, the rationale was explicit. A memo dated May 6, 1947, stamped top secret, stated, "The value to the US of Japanese BW data is of such importance to national security as to far outweigh the value of war crimes prosecution." In other words, atrocities were converted into currency for the Cold War. This bargain erased accountability. Ishii, rather than facing trial, lived out his days in comfort, reportedly consulting for US biological programs until his death in 1959. Many of his subordinates were absorbed into Japan's post-war medical establishment, some rising to prestigious academic positions. Others worked quietly under American sponsorship, passing along data from Unit 731's archives. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, the center of US biological warfare research, these reports were integrated into Project Clear Vision and related programs. Researchers analyzed data from frostbite trials, plague dispersal methods, and aerosol transmission experiments. Officially, American scientists had conducted no such experiments on humans. Unofficially, they had inherited the results of thousands of gruesome human trials, sanitized under the seal of classification. The erasure was systematic. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, prosecutors considered charges against Unit 731 members. Yet files containing Ishi's name were quietly withdrawn. Witnesses who attempted to raise the subject found their testimonies redacted or excluded. In one case, a Chinese doctor's deposition describing plague outbreaks linked to Unit 731's bombs was stricken from the record. American representatives argued that evidence was insufficient, despite their possession of full reports supplied directly by Ishi. This manipulation ensured that Unit 731 faded into the background of the trials, overshadowed by the spectacle of Nazi crimes in Europe. The truth was deliberately buried. Even Japan's own government cooperated in this silence. During the 1950s, as Tokyo became Washington's key Cold War ally in Asia, revisiting Unit 731 threatened the fragile alliance. Survivors who demanded recognition were ignored or silenced. Documents stored in Japanese ministries vanished, incinerated under orders from occupation authorities. Public discussion of Unit 731 remained taboo, relegated to whispers and scattered testimonies from aging witnesses. Textbooks omitted its existence, and official acknowledgement did not come until decades later, still incomplete, still evasive. Fragments of truth survived in Soviet archives. The Khabarovsk trials, long dismissed in the West, contained detailed testimony from Japanese officers about experiments on humans and plague bomb deployments in China. For decades, these records were ridiculed as communist exaggeration. Yet when cross-referenced with declassified American files in the 1990s, their accuracy became undeniable. The Soviets had told the truth, but the truth was inconvenient. The West had chosen silence to preserve its own programs. The implications stretch beyond moral outrage. By erasing Unit 731's crimes, the United States legitimized knowledge obtained through torture and death. The boundary between justice and utility collapsed. Victims were stripped not only of their lives, but of their memory. Their suffering was transformed into data points in classified reports. Their names erased in the name of progress. The Japanese officers responsible evaded accountability, living lives of comfort while survivors carried scars in silence. And the world, lulled by Cold War narratives, never learned the full extent of what happened in those laboratories of death. To this day, vast portions of Unit 731's archives remain sealed or missing. Requests under Japan's information laws often return heavily redacted pages, with crucial sections blacked out. In Washington, declassified fragments hint at a much larger collection stored under restricted access, never released to the public. The absence is not accidental. It is the final act of erasure, ensuring that the victims remain voiceless and the perpetrators remain unexposed. Unit 731's legacy is not only one of horror, but of deliberate silence, enforced by those who profited from its crimes. The disturbing experiments of Unit 731 were not forgotten by accident. They were erased with purpose. The United States and Japan, bound by Cold War necessity, chose secrecy over justice. In doing so, they allowed one of the darkest chapters of human experimentation to vanish from history books, leaving only shadows, rumors, and fragments. But for those who look closely at the redacted files, the truth still glimmers through. It is a truth too disturbing for comfortable history, a truth that proves silence can be more deadly than memory. History is not only written by the victors, it is also silenced by them. As we close this file under the title, 5 Disturbed WWII Agendas that were censored into oblivion, one truth becomes clear. The past we inherit is curated, not complete. What we have explored are not footnotes, but deliberate omissions. The Vatican's silence, Soviet-Nazi exchanges, the erasure of Allied crimes, the whitewashing of Paperclip, and the burial of Unit 731. Each was not forgotten, but excised. Each omission was calculated, designed to preserve alliances, protect institutions, and shape the moral architecture of the post-war world. Yet the fragments that remain, the redacted cables, destroyed files, suppressed testimonies, whisper that history is less a story of good versus evil, and more a ledger of compromises, betrayals, and forbidden truths. The questions linger like smoke from an extinguished fire. How many other files lie locked in vaults, stamped top secret? How many testimonies vanished in flames labeled as routine disposal? And if these 5 shadows survived long enough to resurface, what horrors remain buried still? The silence of archives is not the end of history. It is only the beginning of deeper questions, the kind that demand courage to ask and vigilance to pursue.